Hello everyone, welcome back. So last week on the Command Zone, they released their video on which colors perform best in Commander, and well, they had some not nice things to say about red-white. Things like,
the color that is the worst performing.
Revealed!
Because it is white. So white is the worst performing color by a country mile. It is a negative 4%.
The thing that brings red down is just pairing it with white.
Yeah, don't play Boros. That's like the worst. Don't play Boros. That's like the worst. The worst. Because they're the bottom two colors. The worst. We're gonna talk about color pairs, which are slightly different but close later. But red and white are bottom two.
The worst. It's time for the Legion's response and resurgence.
well, I'm here to tell you that despite what they say and what their numbers say, Boros is still very playable and isn't nearly as bad as they make it seem. Does it struggle in some areas? Sure, but that doesn't mean you can't work around its weaknesses while still playing to its strengths. And so I want to be clear, I think the research they did is fantastic. It certainly opened my eyes to a lot of things, one of which being that maybe it's just worth it to pay 6 for the 2 lands that you get off a Burnished Heart. It's a card that I have been starting to shy away from more recently because of how slow it is, but maybe I need to stop doing that. So I commend them on all the hard work that they put into their research. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. When you actually dig down to the game-by-game level, there's a different story. So allow me to tell you the story of why you shouldn't trust the performance numbers that Boros posted from their study. So we'll start with, I believe they said it was 313 games that they studied, which would make a total of 1,252 total decks. And so of those 1,252 decks, 27 of those decks were red-white decks. And here we can see all 27 of those decks. And so the thing that their stats really focus on is which decks won. Doesn't really care why, doesn't really care how, did the deck win? And unfortunately, the Boros decks that they picked in this study were only able to manage 5 wins out of the 27 games in which they were present. But let's take a look at why. So one of the first things that I noticed is that 16 of those 27 decks were all filmed on Commander Clash. Then a handful from Commander Verse, and a few from MTG Mud Stuff. Shout out to my buddy Andrew. One of the big things with Commander Clash is that they don't typically practice or refine their decks at all. They play them one time and then it's on to something else the next week. So if you play a lot of Boros, one of the things you'll realize is that it's just harder to build a good Boros deck than it is to build something like Mono Black or Mono Green or many of the other color pairings, since you have to be really creative when it comes to your card advantage. Mask of Memory is my main source in most of my Boros decks, and I use about 5 ways to tutor for it, just as a little aside. Another thing too is that Commander Clash just has its own kind of weird meta happening. They typically build on a budget, and I believe they intentionally restrict the power levels so that they play in a way that wouldn't necessarily be representative of what you would find at the shop on Commander Night. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a little bit different than if you're just playing Commander with your group of friends like you normally would. But the biggest takeaway is that they don't spend a lot of time trying to refine decks. You know, they put the deck list together, get it to where it feels like it looks good, and then play it that one time. To make a deck effective, you really need to play it a bunch of times, so you can figure out which cards are working and which ones aren't. Number 2. Only 5 of the 27 decks were using top-tier Boros commanders. I personally consider the top tier of Boros commanders to be Aurelia, Gisela, Iroas, Akiri Lineslinger with Bruce Tarl. Not to say that the other Boros commanders can't be good, they certainly can be, and especially if you put enough time and effort into them to really understand them, but these are the ones that I've known to be consistently powerful over the years. But what that means is that the other 22 Boros commanders that were played for this study are just lacking on either card ability or support from other cards, so there's naturally going to be a disadvantage if you're playing not the best Boros commanders. Couple cases in point, Simic is a very powerful color combination, yet Vorol of the Hullclad, I've seen that deck struggle mightily, and it never really seems like it's able to get off the ground, at least in my experience. So judging a color pair by its weakest commanders is going to give you some weird results. And unfortunately that got factored into the study. Number 3. And so the next point I want to focus on is that of the 27 decks, there were 4 Firesong and Sunspeaker decks and 3 Depala decks. I've played these decks, and these are extremely difficult to build. Playing these commanders is basically like putting the game on hard mode. Firesong plays like a control deck, but because the support for card advantage in red-white is terrible, Firesong and Sunspeaker just aren't well supported as commanders. They're really missing the thing that they need, which is a lot of card draw. Depala is another hard one. Vehicles have had only a few sets worth of support, and there's just some awkwardness in needing creatures to crew your vehicles, and then you're not able to block with them. So vehicles just aren't super well suited to Commander, where being able to attack and block with a single creature is really important. So it's no surprise that 6 of these 7 decks piled losses. 1 Firesong and Sunspeaker deck managed to sneak away with a win. But both of these commanders are just lacking the proper support, Fire Song needing card advantage, and Depala needing a better way to manage vehicles where you're able to have attackers and blockers all the time. So until these decks get a little bit of help, it's just going to be an uphill battle, and it's reasonable to expect that you're going to lose a fair amount of games with them. Number 4. Deck building errors. So I looked through all of the Boros deck lists, and I noticed a few problems while looking at those deck lists. So I noticed that a ton of them were missing Aurelia the War Leader. If you want Gisela in your deck, then you also want Aurelia in your deck too. And yes, even Fire Song and Sunspeaker, that deck does have to attack once in a while, and it does give you another way to get some damage in, even though it's not a heavily combat-based commander. But it's just too good of a card not to include. Literally any deck that cares about attacking wants Aurelia, and so many of them were missing it that it's going to reduce the power level of the deck. Godo was also noticeably absent from a few too many deck lists for my liking. In Boros, equipment and attack steps are your life force. Godo does both. And you have the option to run the Helm of the Host combo if you want, which is an easy way to win the game if you have enough mana. And again, some of that will tie back to the meta. Things like Commander Clash, they're not trying to assemble easy go infinite combos. So I think that they would shy away from that potential Boros win condition. Sunforger was also missing from a few lists that it should have definitely been in, and in my opinion, Sunforger is straight up the best Boros card, followed by Gisela, followed by Aurelia. My win rate after resolving a Sunforger with open mana is like 80 or 90%. It is very high. Opponent will generally need multiple answers if they want to be able to deal with an active Sunforger, and most of the time they can. I also noticed that barely any of these decks were running Duelist Heritage. It's another card that if your deck cares about attacking, you need to be running that card. Giving your stuff double strike is awesome. And so you can bet that if my deck showed up in the study, the win percentage for Boros would be higher. Which is actually another thing that this study doesn't account for, which is the skill of the deck builder and the skill of the pilot.
Come on, man, do some of that pilot shit. Yeah, I got him.
So even though the command zone suggests that your win percentage will decrease if you're playing Boros, for me, because of how long I've been playing it, it's actually going to go up pretty dramatically because of how well I know the cards and my ability to pilot the decks. And so, while I understand that the numbers don't paint a great picture for Boros, when you look a little deeper, it's not nearly as bad as it's made out to be. We see many games from Commander Clash where the decks won't get the needed repetition and revisions to really perform well. And again, they also have their own kind of weird meta going on to make things interesting for the camera. And then we see of those 27 games, only 5 of them were using the best Boros commanders. And we see that 7 of them were played using the hard mode commanders in Fire Song and Sunspeaker and Depala. And finally, we see many deck lists where people weren't leveraging the best tools in Boros, which are Aurelia, Sunforger, and Godo, the way that they should be. So while the command zone says that your chance of winning will decrease with certain color pairs, namely anything involving white and especially Boros, that doesn't have to be true if you spend the time refining your deck,
The worst.
and learning how to pilot it effectively.
That's the way it flies, ice cold, no mistakes. Just wears you down, you get bored, frustrated, do something stupid, and he's got you.
So based on a lot of these things, it's obvious to see why Boros numbers didn't perform well. But when you account for all these things that we've talked about, your chances with Boros aren't going to be significantly better or worse than other colors. It's really just going to come down to, if you can build a good deck and you can pilot it well, you're still going to have a lot of success. And so I'll leave you with, if you enjoy playing the Boros color pair, don't be discouraged. You should still continue playing the Boros color pair.
I say, if it feels good, do it.
All right.
Don't snap my undies.
Anyway, I want to thank my awesome Patreon supporters. If you guys want to help support the channel and vote on which decks I play next, feel free to check out my Patreon at the link below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching.
The worst.
Oh, P.S. So, I know that Josh from the Command Zone has been pretty down on Boros for a long time, and people have asked me what I think about that. It is a little bit annoying to me, simply because they have such a big fan base that when they make a statement like that, you know, they're really putting that notion into a lot of people's head. And so here's what I think about his overall opinion of Boros. I think at one point in time, his opinion was correct. Boros really did struggle to do a lot of things. Maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, he was probably correct. But it seems like every set, Boros has been able to pick up a tool. Maybe it's something small, but it's still something that can smooth out your deck. And so over the last 6 years or so, Boros has gotten a lot of help. There's been a lot of good cards that have been printed, which has really solved a lot of issues for Boros. There's still a couple things to go, namely card draw. But I think it's really a matter of, I think he just needs to update his opinion. At one point what he was saying was true, I don't think what he's saying is necessarily true anymore. There's enough tools in Boros now that you can handle a lot of different problems. As well as, all the damage doubling effects that exist now, you can take people out of the game really quickly. So yes, I think at one point in time, what he was saying was true, but I don't think that it's true anymore, and there'll have to be some event that changes his mind. Also, I'd be totally happy to go on the command zone and show him what's what Boros style, in case anyone was wondering.